Welcome to Biography Vault. Explore a collection of fascinating stories from the lives of historical figures, famous personalities, and unsung heroes. Get inspired, learn, and dive deep into the journeys that shaped the world.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into the life of Nelson Mandela, and you've given us some really fascinating stuff to work with here.
Yeah, it's quite a collection. We're going to go from his early life and how he got into politics all the way to ending apartheid and his huge impact on the whole world. It's going to be amazing to pull out the most important parts of his story.
Right, exactly. And for you listening, this is perfect if you want to understand Mandela deeply, but you don't want to be bogged down with too much detail. That's exactly what we're aiming for here. We'll cover everything important: his childhood, his rise in the ANC, that shift to armed resistance, his long time in prison, finally being freed, becoming president, and wow, even his years as a global leader. Okay, so to kick things off, let's look at his beginnings.
Okay, so Nelson Mandela, well, his birth name was actually Rolihlahla Mandela. He was born on July 18th, 1918 in this small village, Mvezo, in South Africa. Now, this name, Rolihlahla, it means pulling the branch of a tree, but get this, it can also mean troublemaker.
Oh, wow, that's kind of prophetic, isn't it? Like his name hinting at his future. And his family, they weren't just anyone, right?
No, not at all. He came from the Thembu royal family. And, after his father died, something really important happened. He was adopted by the regent of the Thembu people. This opened up a lot of doors for him, especially when it came to education. He got access to some top-notch Western schools.
Whenever you read about these early African leaders in South Africa, Fort Hare University keeps popping up. Our sources really emphasize how important it was.
Oh, absolutely. Fort Hare was like a breeding ground for future leaders. That's where Mandela really got his first taste of politics, got involved with student activism. He was even expelled for taking part in a protest.
So even back then, as a student, that fighting spirit, it was already there. It's fascinating. And then he ends up in Johannesburg in 1941, which seems like a major turning point, right?
Johannesburg. Yeah, that's where things really took off politically for him. He worked as a law clerk and saw firsthand the injustices baked into the legal system. And that's where he met Walter Sisulu, a key figure in all of this.
Sisulu was such a mentor to Mandela, someone who guided him, such a powerful influence. And through Sisulu, he joined the ANC, the African National Congress, in 1944.
And, the whole atmosphere at that time was so charged. Mandela, Sisulu, and Oliver Tambo, they formed the ANC Youth League. They wanted to shake things up. They felt the older generation wasn't doing enough. This youth movement brought new energy and new ideas to the fight against apartheid.
And all this was happening as the National Party took over in 1948 and started putting apartheid into place, that brutal system. It's hard to grasp how deep that inequality ran.
Apartheid was systematic, just awful. It was segregation, discrimination, taking away all political rights from non-white people, all enforced by law. It affected every part of their lives.
Mandela helped organize the ANC's Defiance Campaign in 1949. That was a big step towards taking more direct action, but still nonviolent.
Right. The Defiance Campaign was all about challenging these unjust laws. Civil disobedience, that was the idea. They targeted segregation in public spaces, and those infamous past laws, those were really harsh. Black South Africans had to carry papers everywhere, limiting where they could go, where they could work, where they could even live.
But at some point, that commitment to nonviolence changed. They started to think they needed stronger methods. What pushed them towards that?
I think it was mainly the frustration. They saw that nonviolence wasn't leading to real change, and the government was getting more and more violent in cracking down on protests. The Sharpeville Massacre in 1960, that was a turning point. The police just opened fire on peaceful protesters.
That was such a horrific event, really showed how far the government was willing to go to keep things as they were. It made peaceful change seem impossible.
You're right, it was like a wake-up call. Mandela and other ANC leaders realized nonviolence alone wouldn't work. This is what led to the formation of Umkhonto we Sizwe, also called MK, Spear of the Nation, in 1961. But it's important to remember this wasn't easy. Not everyone in the ANC agreed. Some strongly believed in staying nonviolent. The decision to fight back, it was a tough one, a recognition that the regime wouldn't budge without a fight. This is something we see in other movements too, this struggle between sticking to peaceful methods and, taking up arms when things get really bad.
And Mandela helped create this armed wing of the ANC. It was a huge shift from their previous strategy.
Definitely. MK's goal was to sabotage important government stuff like power plants and military bases. They didn't want a full-blown war. They wanted to pressure the government into talks.
So it was strategic, a calculated risk. They figured the government wouldn't listen otherwise. But this is what led to Mandela's arrest in 1962.
Yes. First, it was for leaving the country illegally and encouraging strikes. Then came the Rivonia trial in 1964, a really crucial moment. Mandela and other ANC leaders were accused of sabotage and treason.
And during the trial, Mandela gave that famous speech defending himself. It's still so powerful today.
Absolutely. It's the one where he talks about his dream of a free and democratic South Africa where everyone is equal, everyone lives in harmony. It was a powerful vision for the future and a powerful condemnation of apartheid.
But even though his words were so strong, the court sentenced him to life in prison in 1964. Devastating for him and the entire movement.
It was. He spent the next 27 years in prison, most of it on Robben Island. The conditions were brutal. A tiny cell, backbreaking work in a lime quarry, which really damaged his eyesight, and even solitary confinement.
But even in prison, Mandela became even more powerful as a symbol of the fight against apartheid. The Free Nelson Mandela campaign, it became a worldwide movement.
Exactly. They wanted to silence him by putting him in prison, but it had the opposite effect. His voice became louder globally. This global pressure, along with resistance inside South Africa, started to have a real impact on the government.
By the late 1980s, the world was condemning apartheid, and South Africa faced crippling economic sanctions. It felt like the regime was crumbling.
It was, and inside the country, more and more people were speaking out against apartheid. This is what led President F.W. de Klerk to start talking to the ANC, which was still banned at the time, a huge turning point.
And then, the moment everyone had been waiting for, February 11, 1990, Nelson Mandela walks free after 27 years. It was such a powerful image, broadcast all over the world. 27 years, it's hard to even imagine. Did any of the accounts we have give a sense of how he felt when he was released, beyond the focus on reconciliation?
Yes. Some accounts mention that he immediately got to work. His focus was on ending apartheid and building a new South Africa. Of course, those years in prison had to have affected him deeply, but he seemed more concerned about the future than the past. And what's amazing is how he acted. He didn't want revenge. He wanted reconciliation. He pushed for a peaceful transition to a democracy where everyone could vote.
That's incredible, to go through all that and still be focused on forgiveness and unity. What a remarkable leader. And then he became a key figure in the negotiations to end apartheid and set up free elections.
Yes, and those talks, they were so difficult. There were deep fears and prejudices on all sides. The fact that they succeeded and South Africa transitioned relatively peacefully, that's a testament to Mandela's leadership and diplomacy.
And in 1993, he and de Klerk were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their work. What a recognition.
Absolutely. It was acknowledging their work in creating the foundation for a new democratic South Africa, free from racial discrimination. And then in 1994, a historic moment.
Yes, Nelson Mandela became South Africa's first black president. The end of apartheid was official. The whole nation must have been filled with hope.
Oh, it was. There was so much hope for the future. As president, Mandela focused on unity and reconciliation. A big part of that was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It was praised around the world, but also criticized. Some victims felt that those who committed crimes under apartheid weren't held accountable enough, and giving amnesty instead of punishment is still debated today. This raises a tough question. How do you balance justice with forgiveness and moving forward after a conflict? It's something many countries still struggle with.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it was such a bold and innovative approach. It wasn't about revenge, it was about truth and forgiveness. Truly groundbreaking.
It was. And Mandela's leadership during this fragile period was so important. He steered South Africa away from what could have been a civil war and towards a more united future.
After one term, he decided to step down in 1999. That set an important example for democratic leadership, especially in Africa.
He could have stayed in power longer, but he chose to step down. That showed his commitment to democracy and the peaceful transfer of power. And even after retiring, he continued to work for good through the Nelson Mandela Foundation. He was the voice for positive change until the end.
In his later years, he dedicated himself to so many important causes, like fighting HIV/AIDS, promoting peace, and advocating for education in Africa. He was a global figure right up until his death on December 5, 2013, at 95. People all over the world mourned his passing.
They did. As our sources show, his legacy is immense. He's considered the father of modern South Africa, a global symbol of so many important values.
Absolutely. And, for you listening, there's so much we can learn from his life. Think about his perseverance, his ability to forgive, even after all he suffered. That's truly inspiring.
And the way he led South Africa through that transition from apartheid to democracy, that's remarkable. He's a symbol of resilience, of fighting for justice no matter what, of the power of forgiveness and reconciliation. He inspires so many people who are fighting for freedom and equality.
The importance of fighting for freedom and equality, even when it seems impossible, that's a central theme of his life. It's so powerful.
Something else that's really interesting, and our sources talk about this, is how the movement evolved. First, they were committed to nonviolence, but later they realized they needed to take up arms to force the regime to negotiate. It shows how complex these struggles can be.
He became a global icon, representing the fight against oppression in all its forms, a symbol of hope for those striving for liberation and dignity.
In the end, his story shows us the power of leadership and sacrifice for something bigger than ourselves. He achieved so much in his pursuit of a better world.
So as we finish up this deep dive into the life of Nelson Mandela, using the incredible sources you shared with us, it's clear that his impact on South Africa and the world is immense. He showed us that even when things seem impossible, we can achieve transformative change.
And this brings us to a question for you, our listener. Think about Mandela's focus on reconciliation after all that division in South Africa. What can we learn from that? How can we apply those lessons to the problems we see in the world today, the divisions and injustices? It's something worth thinking about deeply.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing these amazing sources with us and for joining us on this deep dive into the life of a truly extraordinary human being.